Good evening and welcome back to another episode of The Longing. Today we're going to once again be continuing to read The Sleeper Awakes by H.G. Wells. So let's get going. The tailor was assisting Graham into a dark purple combination garment, stockings, vest and pants in one, as the thick-set man came back from the corner to meet the man with the flaxen beard returning from the balcony. They began speaking quickly in an undertone. Their bearing had an unmistakable quality of anxiety. Over the purple undergarment came a complex garment of bluish white, and Graham was clothed in the fashion once more, and saw himself sallow-faced, unshaven, and shaggy still, but at least naked no longer, and in some indefinable, unprecedented way graceful. "I must shave," he said, regarding himself in the glass. "In a moment," said Howard. The persistent stare ceased. The young man closed his eyes, reopened them, and with a lean hand extended, advanced on Graham. Then he stopped, with his hand slowly gesticulating, and looked about him. "A seat," said Howard impatiently, and in a moment the flaxen-bearded man had a chair behind Graham. "Sit down, please," said Howard. Graham hesitated, and in the other hand of the wild-eyed man he saw the glint of steel. "Don't you understand, sire?" cried the flaxen-bearded man with hurried politeness. "He is going to cut your hair." "Oh," cried Graham, enlightened. "But you called him a I cannot say that one. A capillotomist. Precisely. He is one of the finest artists in the world." Graham sat down abruptly. The flaxen-bearded man disappeared. The capillotomist came forward, examined Graham's ears, and surveyed him, felt the back of his head, and would have sat down again to regard him, but for Howard's audible impatience. Forthwith, with rapid movements and a succession of deftly handled implements, he shaved Graham's chin, clipped his moustache, and cut and arranged his hair. All this he did without a word, with something of the rapt air of a poet inspired. And as soon as he had finished, Graham was handed a pair of shoes. Suddenly a loud voice shouted. It seemed from a piece of machinery in the corner. At once, the people know all over the city. Work is being stopped. Work is being stopped. Wait for nothing, but come." This shout appeared to perturb Howard exceedingly. By his gestures it seemed to Graham that he hesitated between two directions. Abruptly he went towards the corner where the apparatus stood about the little crystal ball. As he did so, the undertone of tumultuous shouting from the archway that had continued during all these occurrences rose to a mighty sound, roared as if it were sweeping past, and fell again as if receding swiftly. It drew Graham after it with an irresistible attraction. He glanced at the thick-set man, and then obeyed his impulse. In 2 strides he was down the steps and in the passage, and in a score he was out upon the balcony upon which the 3 men had been standing. Chapter 5. The Moving Ways. He went to the railings of the balcony and stared upwards. An exclamation of surprise at his appearance, and the movements of a number of people came from the great area below. His first impression was of overwhelming architecture. The place into which he looked was an aisle of titanic buildings, curving spaciously in either direction. Overhead, mighty cantilevers sprang together across the huge width of the place, and a tracery of translucent material shot out to the sky. Gigantic globes of cool white light shamed the pale sunbeams that filtered down through the girders and wires. Here and there a gossamer suspension bridge dotted with foot passengers flung across the chasm, and the air was webbed with slender cables. A cliff of edifice hung above him, he perceived as he glanced upward, and the opposite facade was grey and dim, and broken by great archings, circular perforations, at balconies, buttresses, turret projections, myriads of vast windows, and an intricate scheme of architectural relief. Athwart these ran inscriptions horizontally and obliquely in an unfamiliar lettering. Here and there, close to the roof cables of a peculiar stoutness were fastened, and drooped in a steep curve to circular openings on the opposite side of the space. And even as Graham noted these, a remote and tiny figure of a man clad in pale blue arrested his attention. This little figure was far overhead, across the space beside the higher fastening of one of these festoons, hanging forward from a little ledge of masonry, and handling some well-nigh invisible strings, dependent from the line. Then suddenly, with a swoop that sent Graham's heart into his mouth, this man had rushed down the curve and vanished through a round opening on the hither side of the way. Graham had been looking up as he came out upon the balcony, and the things he saw above and opposed to him had at first seized his attention, to the exclusion of anything else. Then suddenly he discovered the roadway. It was not a roadway at all, as Graham understood such things, for in the 19th century the only roads and streets were beaten tracks of motionless earth, jostling rivulets of vehicles between narrow footways. But this roadway was 300 feet across, and it moved. It moved all save the middle, the lowest part. For a moment the motion dazzled his mind. Then he understood. Under the balcony this extraordinary roadway ran swiftly to Graham's right, an endless flow rushing along as fast as a 19th century express train, an endless platform of narrow, transverse, overlapping slats with little interspaces that permitted it to follow the curvatures of the street. Upon it were seats and here and there little kiosks, but they swept by too swiftly for him to see what might be therein. From this nearest and swiftest platform, a series of others descended to the centre of the space. Each moved to the right, each perceptibly slower than the one above it. But the difference in pace was small enough to permit anyone to step from any platform to the one adjacent, and so walk uninterruptedly from the swiftest to the motionless middle way. Beyond this middle way was another series of endless platforms rushing with varying pace to Graham's left, and seated in crowds upon the two widest and swiftest platforms, or stepping from one to another down the steps, or swarming over the central space, was an innumerable and wonderfully diversified multiple of people. "You must not stop here," shouted Howard suddenly at his side. "You must come away at once." Graham made no answer. He heard without hearing. The platforms ran with a roar and the people were shouting. He perceived women and girls with flowing hair, beautifully robed with bands crossing between the breasts. These first came out of the confusion. Then he perceived that the dominant note in that kaleidoscope of costume was the pale blue that the tailor boy had worn. He became aware of cries of, "The sleeper! What has happened to the sleeper?" And it seemed as though the rushing platforms before him were suddenly spattered with the pale buff of human faces, and then still more thickly. He saw pointing fingers. He perceived that the motionless central area of this huge arcade just opposite to the balcony was densely crowded with blue-clad people. Some sort of struggle had sprung into life. People seemed to be pushed up the running platforms on either side and carried away against their will. They would spring off so soon as they were beyond the thick of the confusion, and run back towards the conflict. "It is the sleeper! Verily it is the sleeper!" shouted voices. "That is never the sleeper!" shouted others. More and more faces were turned to him. At the intervals along this central area, Graham noted openings, pits, apparently the heads of staircases going down, with people ascending out of them and descending into them. The struggle, it seemed, centred about the one of these nearest to him. People were running down the moving platforms to this, leaping dexterously from platform to platform. The clustering people on the higher platforms seemed to divide their interest between this point and the balcony. A number of sturdy little figures clad in a uniform of bright red and working methodically together were employed, it seemed, in preventing access to this descending staircase. About them a crowd was rapidly accumulating. Their brilliant colour contrasted vividly with the whitish blue of their antagonists, for the struggle was indisputable. And with that, excuse me, we come to the end of the episode. So yeah, it's interesting so far. But anyway, thank you for joining us today. I hope you all have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon or night. no matter what time of day it is. I hope you all have a wonderful one of it. And as always, we will be back tomorrow for more of The Longing. Goodbye.